All right, well, good to see everybody again. I hope everybody is doing well. We continue with our study of American history, and the material that we're going to be covering here in this lecture covers, at least in the beginning, the administration of President James Monroe. And then we're going to slide over into the administration of Andrew Jackson, a particularly important and compelling period in American history. So, the War of 1812 has come to an end, and even though in some ways militarily it was a draw, Americans perceived, and with some justification, that they had won the conflict. And one of the greatest heroes of the war was, of course, Andrew Jackson. He had not only defeated the Creek Indians, which is a substantial military achievement, he had also beaten the British at the Battle of New Orleans, the last battle of the war, one of the most dramatic battles of the war, one of the most important battles of the war, since it saved the Louisiana Purchase for the United States. And of course, having Louisiana Purchase is going to have enormous consequences for us as we're going forward. And it made Jackson a household name. It made him a military hero. And there were a lot of people who thought that he should become the President of the United States. Americans love to elect their war heroes to the presidency. But in 1816, which was a presidential election year, Jackson demurred. He had no interest in the job, and therefore President Madison's Secretary of State, James Monroe, became the nominee of the Democratic-Republican Party, which, remember, is the only party now because the Federalists had essentially self-destructed as a result of the Hartford Convention, and so they're dead. The Federalist Party is gone. The Democratic-Republicans are the only party that's around. They've gotten tired of the long name and have taken to just calling themselves the Republicans. This is, ironically, the birth of what will become the Democratic Party in modern times. But with just one party in place, there was no question of who the victor was going to be, and so Monroe had been selected. Monroe was duly elected, and he was grateful for Jackson's support in the endeavor, and so he appointed Jackson to be a major general in the regular United States Army and gave him his old command, which of course was the defense of the southern United States. And for the Americans, this was a particularly volatile region because of the Seminole Indians. Remember that Florida, to include not just what today we know as Florida, but also the southern coast of Alabama and Mississippi, that all belonged to Spain and had belonged to Spain since the end of the American Revolution. There weren't a lot of Spaniards there, however, and the Spaniards that were there were in just a couple of settlements, St. Augustine, Pensacola, Mobile, and the Seminole Indians were therefore allowed to do pretty much what they wanted, and they were in the habit of raiding out of Spanish territory into the United States and attacking Americans and American homesteads. Of course, this was something that was unacceptable to both the press and the public, as well as to the Monroe administration. It was Jackson's job to deal with the Seminoles, and he was not the kind of man who was simply going to shoo them back across the border and then hope to be able to somehow forestall their next wave of attacks. It was too much territory. It was a vast wilderness. His army was very, very small, so there was no real way to defend against the Seminoles except to go over to the offensive, and that is, of course, what Jackson did. He had campaigned in the western panhandle of Florida during the War of 1812, where he had a lot of familiarity with the topography and the roads and this sort of thing. And so he chased the Seminoles back into western Florida in hot pursuit. He captured some Spanish forts, arrested a couple of English subjects who he claimed were spies, held a court-martial, convicted them, and then hung them. And then he went on to capture the city of Pensacola, which was the capital of Spanish Florida. And of course, this caused enormous outrage by the Spaniards. This was a violation of international law, and they demanded that President Monroe fire Jackson, cashier him, throw him out of the army, and make restitution for the damages that Jackson had done. And of course, the implied threat here is that if the United States did not yield to those demands, then Spain would declare war on the U.S. And President Monroe was inclined to give in to the Spanish. He didn't want another war, since we had just gotten out of one. The Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, was basically of the same mind, but the person who wasn't was the new Secretary of State, and that was John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, the second president. And John Quincy Adams believed that the Spanish were bluffing. He was well aware that Spain was embroiled in numerous colonial wars in Central and South America. It was in the process of having its empire wrested away from it by the citizens of those regions. Spain, of course, had been conquered and occupied by Napoleon during the just ended war in Europe. The Spanish have been in decline for a very long time. They're in no condition to add a new war to their already long list of conflicts. They're certainly in no condition to have a war against the United States. And so John Quincy Adams prevailed upon President Monroe to call the Spanish bluff. And Monroe agreed. So Adams got a hold of the Spaniards, and he said, yes, this is all very unfortunate. The attacks by the Seminoles coming out of your territory is something, of course, that the United States can no longer endure. General Jackson was completely within his rights of hot pursuit in chasing the Indians into this territory. It's only offensive campaigning that's going to end this problem as far as we're concerned. And we recognize that this violates Spain's territorial sovereignty, and that is something that Spain does not like. But we're going to continue to pursue Indians into Florida. And if this is something that the Spanish cannot tolerate, then the best way to solve the problem is for Spain to sell Florida to the United States. Then it'll be American territory, and we can chase the Seminole Indians there as much as we want. And this counter really surprised the Spanish. They had not been expecting this at all. And they found it unbelievable that the United States would be willing to go to war for a place like Florida. After all, Florida was one godforsaken swamp. There wasn't anything there of real value except a couple of underdeveloped ports with very small towns called cities nestled next to them. Why would the U.S. be willing to have a war with Spain over Florida? And of course, being Europeans, and therefore familiar with the European way of doing diplomacy, the Spaniards believe that there's always an ulterior motive behind any diplomatic proposal. And when the Spanish looked at their maps, they realized that the Americans must have such a motive. And that motive was to pick a fight over Florida, about which the United States probably did not care, in order to justify an invasion of the Spanish Southwest, i.e. Texas, what will become New Mexico and Arizona and California. That vast southwestern portion of the country and most of North America's west coast that remained Spanish territory, but which now butted up against the United States courtesy of Louisiana Purchase. The Americans don't care about Florida, but they do care about that. And a war with Spain over Florida is an excuse to invade the Southwest and gobble up Texas and California and that sort of thing. And so the Spaniards said, no, we're way too clever for that. We're not going to fall for this trick. We really can't afford a war with Florida, but we need to hold on to the Southwest and to California. And now we are going to basically pull the rug out from under the Americans by agreeing to sell them Florida. And so John Quincy Adams got together with the Spanish foreign ambassador, and in February of 1819, the two men signed what was called the Adams-Onis Treaty. The Adams-Onis Treaty, O-N-I-S. The Adams-Onis Treaty sells Florida to the United States in exchange for the U.S. taking on the claims of American citizens against Spain. So Americans who'd been attacked by the Seminoles were in essence suing Spain for damages. The U.S. says, we'll take on that $5 million and you give us Florida. And so the deal was done, and the United States now gets all the territory that it's ever going to have east of the Mississippi River. The other thing the Adams-Onis Treaty does is to define the line between Louisiana Purchase and the Spanish Southwest, and that line goes, of course, all the way up the border of Texas, and then it crosses over to the Pacific at the southern border of what is today the state of Oregon. And so the U.S. finally legitimately has a Pacific coast. It's not entirely ours because from Oregon all the way up to the southern border of Alaska, which is still owned at this point by the Russian Empire, that territory known as the Oregon Country was jointly occupied by the United States and Great Britain. Both claimed it, but both understood that there were a very small number of their citizens there. The British basically stayed up in the northern part of it, engaged in the fur trade. Americans who went there went to the river valleys of Washington and Oregon and became farmers. And since there didn't really seem to be much to argue about yet, the U.S. and England had agreed to jointly occupy the Oregon Country until they got to the point where they needed to and figured out how to divide it up. So the U.S., courtesy of the Adams-Onis Treaty, has an official, legal Pacific coast now. The border between the Spanish Southwest and Louisiana Purchase is defined. Florida and what will become the Gulf Coast of Alabama and Mississippi are now American territory, and the U.S. continues its sort of relentless expansion that's been going on in one way or another ever since the first English colonists landed at Jamestown at the dawn of the 17th century. So Americans are increasingly moving west, but they're also dealing with the aftermath of the War of 1812. And that war had been much harder than the war hawks had promised. It had been much harder than anybody had anticipated. And one of the reasons for that was that America lacked an industrial base. Another reason for that is that in 1811, just as the war was about to break out, the 20-year charter establishing the first national bank had expired, and it was not renewed. The bank went out of existence, and that turned out to be a problem during the war because the U.S. government had no mechanism to easily sell bonds, collect taxes, try and manage the currency and that sort of thing. So one of the things that comes out of the War of 1812 experience is a proposal to fix those problems. And the idea was jointly President Monroe, or rather outgoing President Madison's, and Henry Clay. Remember Henry Clay of Kentucky, now Speaker of the House of Representatives, a very formidable politician. Henry Clay comes up with what is called the American system. The American system. And the American system consists of three components. And the first of these is to recreate the national bank, to put that institution back in place. The second proposal is to establish a protective tariff to shield American manufacturers from foreign competition until those American manufacturers can become established and profitable, and thus we develop an American industrial base. And then the third proposal is a system of federally financed internal improvements. So the third proposal is a system of federally financed internal improvements. Roads, bridges, canals, stuff that would make it easier in wartime to move troops and supplies. And we hadn't had that during the Revolution, and it caused trouble. We hadn't had it during the War of 1812. It caused even more trouble. So if the federal government starts to spend federal tax revenues to build roads, bridges, and canals, that helps alleviate that difficulty in wartime. But of course, in peacetime, that will also simplify the movement of commerce, the westward migration of Americans, the delivery of the mail, all these sorts of things. So the three parts of the American system that Clay proposes and champions: a new national bank, the second Bank of the United States as it will be called, a protective tariff, and a system of federally financed internal improvements. And the timing for this was very good because in the immediate aftermath of the wartime experience, Americans recognized that the lack of the bank, the lack of an internal infrastructure, the lack of American industry had been detrimental to the war effort. And so whereas several of these proposals, the bank and the protective tariff, had been fought over during the Washington administration when Alexander Hamilton had championed them, they were less controversial now because Clay and Madison and then Monroe could sell them as defense measures. And it's always true that Americans are much more willing to go along with something if you can argue that it's good for the national defense than they might be if you were just arguing, hey, this is wise economic policy, or this is wise diplomacy, or something like that. So there was a fight over these things, but between Clay and Monroe, and given the fact there's only one party, so there's no opposition party, so the argument is internal to the Republican Party. That makes things a lot easier. The second bank was established in 1816. Unfortunately, there is a depression in 1819. The reasons for that are complicated. It has a lot to do with monetary policy and the behavior of the state banks, but in the minds of a lot of Americans, they're going to blame the national bank for that depression, and that's going to sour the public on the national bank and set it up to be a point of contention when Andrew Jackson becomes president. The protective tariff idea, same difficulties here that you had seen argued over when Washington was president. Hamilton proposed this concept, which at that time had not gone through. A protective tariff is good. It's going to spur the growth of American industry. That's going to make America more self-sufficient. That's good in peacetime. It's good in wartime. But most of that industry is going to spring up in the New England states, where you have big cities, therefore you have large pools of labor, where you have the ports that make the movement of raw materials and the movement of manufactured goods easier, more efficient, cheaper to accomplish. It's also where you have a relatively short growing season and a lot less good land for farming, and therefore people are looking for other types of economic activity. And although initially, at the very least, protective tariffs are going to drive up the cost of all goods, as Americans at first will not be able to manufacture them as cheaply as the Europeans can, or secondly, if they still have to buy from the Europeans because they're the only people capable of extending credit, then you have to pay the taxed goods that are being shipped into America. The New England states are going to get the benefit of jobs and economic activity and tax revenues as a result of a protective tariff, whereas Southerners, where you're not going to get the development of industry in any significant way because there's too much good land for farming, the growing season is long, the populations are more spread out, Southerners are just going to get a higher cost of living. And that's why they had managed to kill the proposal for a protective tariff under the Washington administration. But now when you hang the banner of national defense on a protective tariff, then it's hard to resist. But as I said, the timing is very good because the U.S. was actually poised for an industrial revolution. And a couple of reasons for that are circumstantial. So one of the things, of course, that you need in wartime is to manufacture lots of weapons. And the United States had no ability to mass produce muskets during the War of 1812. And as a consequence of that, everything still had to be put together by gunsmiths, artisans, every musket its own unique creature, even though they were basically similar, but you couldn't swap parts between musket and another musket. You couldn't stockpile spare parts so that you could replace a component if it wore out or if it broke or something like that. So if the trigger for a musket broke, you had to send that musket to a gunsmith who would handcraft a trigger that would work in that particular musket. And obviously that is the traditional way of doing things, but it's very, very slow. And when you were trying to mobilize very quickly, this is a real impediment to your national defense. So as soon as we got involved in the War of 1812, the government looked for a way to solve that problem, and the man who said that he could tackle it was a northerner from Connecticut by the name of Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney was already famous as an inventor. He had invented the cotton gin. The cotton gin had solved the problem of mass producing cotton in the American South. Okay? And the American South was perfect for growing cotton. Cotton, of course, was very useful because it could be woven into a durable and lightweight cloth, which was much preferable to heavy wools and that sort of thing that people were used to wearing. And the difficulty here is that the only part of the cotton plant that's useful for making cloth is the flax. That is the white, silky part but it is attached to seeds. And the best way to sort of explain this is to think of a piece of thread or hair on Velcro and how hard it is to pull that hair or that thread off the Velcro. It sort of gives you an idea of what it's like to pull the flax, the white part of the cotton plant, away from the seed. And although you could plant as much cotton as you wanted and you could grow as much cotton as you wanted, this business of separating the flax from the seed was extremely time-consuming, and it meant that before you could do much of it, your crop would have rotted. It would have gone to waste. And that was therefore a problem that inhibited making cotton a cash crop in the true sense of the word. But there was a desire and a demand for cotton in Europe, where it was very expensive and considered a luxury item. The monarchs had started to wear it, which of course made it all a fashion rage and that kind of thing. And Eli Whitney solved that bottleneck in cotton production when he was visiting some friends in the South, and they were talking about it, and he said, I think that I can figure that out. And he went and locked himself in a barn for a couple of days, and when he came out, he had invented the cotton gin. And to oversimplify things, the cotton gin is a big trough that's got a bunch of sort of saw blade looking things in it that are connected to a crank. And on one side of this is a wire mesh through which the saw blades can go through, but it's too narrow for the cotton seeds to go through. So you dump the raw cotton into this trough, you start turning the crank, that makes the teeth go through the grate, they grab the flax and pull it to the other side of the grate, but the seeds can't get through. And with the invention of the cotton gin, one person could now do the work that it used to take 10 people 100 hours to do. And suddenly you have solved the real problem in mass production of cotton. And this set off a cotton boom that enabled Southerners to turn cotton into their new cash crop. It's what replaced tobacco. And the invention of the power loom in England made it possible to take all of this raw cotton that's being produced and rapidly weave it into cotton cloth, which now became cheap enough that even the most common people could afford to buy it. And this, therefore, Eli Whitney had done for the South. And ironically, he had also perpetuated the institution of slavery with the cotton gin, because remember, the tobacco boom had gone bust a long time ago, and with the tobacco boom kind of at its end, the need for slave labor had been waning. Most Southerners, as well as Northerners, had always had some discomfort with slavery and were looking forward to the day that it would die out. They didn't know when that would happen. They didn't know how it would happen. Some of them were pushing that moment. Others were not. But nonetheless, everybody kind of envisioned that slavery is going to die out. That's why the words slave and slavery aren't woven into the Constitution, even though slavery is clearly made constitutional in 3 places in that document: the Fugitive Slave Clause, the African Slave Clause, and the 3/5 Compromise. But with the invention of the cotton gin and an explosion in cotton production across the country, the need for that cheap, reliable labor force that slavery represented suddenly was there again. And so the cotton gin gave slavery a new lease on life. It reasserted slavery at the core of the South agricultural economy. And so you can say that Eli Whitney had done a favor for Southerners by inventing the cotton gin. Well, now trying to mass produce muskets for the U.S. Army during the War of 1812, he's going to do a favor for the New England and the Middle states as well. And so what Eli Whitney does is that he comes up with a series of machines. These machines are tuned to very fine tolerances, and they are built to make the parts required to manufacture a musket: barrels and barrel bands and gun stocks and triggers and sear springs and ramrods and these sorts of things. And so what Whitney does is he builds machines to build the parts, and to build all of these parts exactly the same, to the exact same specifications. and he didn't get it done in time for the War of 1812. It wasn't finished until 1816, but in 1816, he brought representatives from the War Department to the Springfield, Massachusetts armory, where he'd been doing his work. He had 10 muskets laid out on a table, and as they watched, he went and disassembled all of the muskets. He threw all of the barrels over here, and he threw all of the triggers over there, and all the ramrods over here, and all the gun stocks over there. And then he scrambled the parts up, so you didn't know what barrel had been with what ramrod, with what barrel bands, with what stock, with what trigger guard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, while everyone watched in amazement, he reassembled 10 muskets, and he test fired every one of them, and every one of them worked. And what Eli Whitney has just invented is the concept of interchangeable parts, which of course is the backbone of the modern system of mass production. Everything basically that you go into a store and buy is made with interchangeable parts. Your desk, your car, your refrigerator, your TV, your phone, all of those are made with interchangeable parts. And so this is a revolution in the manufacturing process, and it would put a big spur into the development of all kinds of new products and all kinds of new industry, with the resultant economic activity that goes along with it. And therefore, you have this opportunity to begin to build American industry up from the ground up on the basis of interchangeable parts, and a protective tariff would shield that industry from foreign competition while it is blossoming and it's coming to life. The power loom, which was invented in England, of course, was the key to taking that raw cotton that was now flooding the market courtesy of Whitney's cotton gin, and turning it into fabric so that it was really useful to people. The power loom was a huge machine, incredibly complicated, and it was the great industrial secret of its age. The British had invented it. They guarded that secret jealously. There were no specifications published. There were no drawings, no diagrams in existence about the power loom. You couldn't get them because the British wanted to keep the power loom as their own thing. They would let you come and look at it. You could marvel at the complexity of the machine, but the machine was so complex that looking at it really wasn't going to be very helpful. It'd be akin to, taking us to a nuclear reactor and saying, hey, here's a nuclear reactor, and we could look at it and we say, wow, this is complex and it's huge and most impressive, but then we couldn't go home and build one for ourselves. And so the British felt pretty confident that the power loom secret was safe. They had not counted on a fellow from Massachusetts by the name of Francis Cabot Lowell, however, who visited England, asked to see a power loom, went and looked at it for a long time, studied it, thanked the British for the opportunity, got on a boat, and on the way home, from his memory, which was photographic, he sketched out the power loom. In other words, just by looking at it, this brilliant man had figured out how it worked, and he drew out how to build one. And when he got home, he and some investors built an American power loom, and suddenly the secret was out. And in Massachusetts, you had the growth not only of an armaments industry, thanks to Eli Whitney, you had the growth of a textile industry. And so some of that southern cotton now goes up to New England, which is therefore making money off slave-grown cotton as much as Southerners are as a consequence. You would have other kinds of industries that would show up, not just the mass production of cloth and weapons, but all kinds of things like shoes and wagons and barrels and these sorts of things. And moving all this around becomes a lot easier too, because the steamboat has come into existence. And so the first one sailed American waters in 1811. By the time you get into the late 18-teens, they're becoming more and more common. They're certainly, the mainstay of transportation on the waterways by the time you get into the 1820s and the 1830s. And this made it much easier to move commerce because, whereas it had always been easy to go downstream, with goods going upstream had been difficult and time-consuming. Now with the steam engine, it's possible for ships to fight the current and to go where people want them to go when they want to go there, instead of relying on the way that the water is flowing. And so America is growing, it's getting bigger. That means the system of federally financed internal improvements is a really good idea. You build the first national road, which follows the route that Edward Braddock had taken on his way to Fort Duquesne during the French and Indian War. You begin to build canals. Some of these are government, some of these are privately financed, and this sort of thing. But the United States is growing by leaps and bounds. It is becoming a formidable economic power as well, and everything seems to be going extremely well. But there were still problems, and one of those problems is going to raise its head and threaten the country far faster than anybody thought, and that was the problem of slavery in Louisiana Purchase. So remember, when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Jefferson had believed he'd added so much territory to the national domain. He increased the size of the country by doubling it. There's twice as much land now as there had been before. Jefferson thought it would take Americans until the 1970s to settle all that territory. He was way off the mark. But even for Jefferson, the speed with which this territory was settled was mind-boggling. And so by 1817, you had so many people move into the territory of Missouri on the west bank of the Mississippi River, basically opposite of Illinois for the most part, but a little piece of Kentucky and Tennessee as well, that it had the necessary number of people to hold a state constitution convention, draft a constitution, submit it to Congress, and ask for admission into the Union as a state. It takes 60,000 people. The Missouri had it. In a way, this is not surprising because the Ohio River flows into the Mississippi at the southeastern corner of Missouri, and then you've got the Missouri River that's about halfway up the boundary of the state that runs into the Mississippi from the west. So the rivers, which are the highways, had taken people basically to Missouri, and they had settled there. And so Missouri asked to enter the Union as a state, and there's nothing particularly unusual about that. All kinds of states have entered the Union. Louisiana became a state in 1812. You have Kentucky and Tennessee that have become states, and Ohio has become a state. You've established the method by which territories become states way back under the Confederation with the Land Ordinance of 1785. And so this is a process that everyone is familiar with. And some states have entered the Union as slave states, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. Others have entered as free states, Ohio, Indiana, for example. So this seems like routine business, except that when Missouri asked to come into the Union as a state, it is anything but routine, because Missouri asked to enter the Union as a slave state, And that's a problem for a couple of reasons. First off, with the exception of Louisiana, which was kind of a given. Louisiana had New Orleans. It was ready to become a state almost as soon as Louisiana Purchase was made. It became a state during the War of 1812. But if we ignore Louisiana, Missouri is going to be the first state carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. And therefore, what happens in Missouri, in essence, establishes a precedent. Think of slavery as the default position. So if you want to delete a document on your computer and you push delete, it doesn't just do it right away, right? It pops up that little window and it says, are you sure you want to delete this document? And there are two buttons, yes and no, and the no button is highlighted. In other words, the computer is making the assumption that this is a mistake, you don't really want to do that, and so you have to actually choose yes. You have to proactively say, yes, I want to delete. Well, slavery is, in essence, the no button here. It is the default choice. Slavery goes everywhere it is not prohibited by law from going. So the Northwest Ordinance, passed first by the Congress of the Confederation and then reenacted by the Congress under the Constitution, had forbidden slavery in the old Northwest Territory, what would be Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, that had all been closed to slavery. And so slavery didn't go there. Climate, soil, geography probably meant that it never really would, but in any substantial way, but legally it had been barred. But south of the Ohio River, where climate, soil, and geography were conducive to cash crops, and where there was no prohibition, slavery had gone. It had gone into Kentucky, it had gone into Tennessee, it had gone in Louisiana, it's already in the territories of Alabama and Mississippi, and so slavery is the default position. If Missouri comes to the Union as a slave state, you're basically establishing the precedent that all the states that will be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase will be slave states. And that's where the problem comes in, because when the bill to admit Missouri into the Union shows up in Congress in 1819, so the Missouri, holds its convention. It takes a while for it to get to Congress because Congress only meets 3 months out of the year. So business comes up before it very slowly. When the bill to admit Missouri into the Union shows up in Congress in early 1819, you have 11 free states and you have 11 slave states. So there's a balance east of the Mississippi, 11 free states and 11 slave states. And you sort of look at the territories, you can say, okay, well, we're going to add Alabama and Mississippi as slave states at some point, and we're going to add Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan as free states at some point. But at the moment, 11 to 11. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because the number of slave states and the number of free states is going to dictate who controls the Congress. So remember that in the House of Representatives, the lower branch of the Congress, we have representation of the states in proportion to their population. And although the South was geographically larger than the North, it was much more sparsely populated. So the North was in control of the House through dint of superior population. But in the Senate, every state is treated equally, and every state has 2 senators. And so you have 22 free state senators, you have 22 slave state senators, and it doesn't take but a couple of northern senators who are very loyal to the Republican Party to vote with the southern states to either ensure that legislation passes or legislation doesn't pass. The South has tended to dominate the national government ever since the creation of the Constitution. Ask yourself, how many presidents have we had? Well, we've had Washington, we've had Adams, we've had Jefferson, we've had Madison, we've had Monroe. So we've had 5 presidents. Of those 5 presidents, how many have been from the North? And the answer, of course, is 1, John Adams. And he got a single 4-year term. How many presidents from the South? Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. So 4 Southern presidents, in fact, all 4 from Virginia, and all 4 got 2 terms. So the South has dominated the presidency, it's dominated the Supreme Court, it's dominated the Senate, and therefore the Southern interpretation of the Constitution, the policies in terms of economics and trade and whatnot that the South prefers have been the ones that have been enacted. And this is much to the frustration of the North because they believe that the government is favoring the South and not doing the things that the denser population of the North, the slowly industrializing population of the North, the slowly urbanizing population of the North wants. And that makes this business of Missouri all important because Northerners are tired of the South running the show. And they don't want all of the states west of the Mississippi River to become slave states, because if they become slave states, then they will be dominated by Southern-minded politicians and Southern policy and Southern economics, and the South will have a perpetual stranglehold on the national government to the detriment of the people of the northern states. And if you don't think that can happen, then go ask the Federalist Party what happened to it when it stopped being half of the electorate and became less than half. It got the War of 1812, it got the Embargo Act, it got destroyed the Hartford Convention, all these bad things. So the evidence of what happens when you lose your grip on political power is right there, and it's very, very recent, and the North does not want to experience that again. Of course, flip the coin over, the South doesn't want all of those states west of the Mississippi to become free states, because cotton wears out the soil like tobacco. It wears out the soil, and scientific agriculture didn't really exist yet, so replenishing the soil involved allowing it to lay fallow for years, and that meant that you were always pushing west to find new, fresh, fertile soil in which to grow your cash crops. And there were a few places like the river deltas, especially the Mississippi River Delta, where annual floods, routinely replenish the soil, but there were lots of places where that was not true. And cotton yields in places like South Carolina were already beginning to go down as the soil was on its way to exhaustion. And so Southerners needed that land for cotton production west of the Mississippi, and that meant they needed slavery west of the Mississippi. And another argument Southerners are going to have about this is that, why should Missouri be treated differently than any other slave state? Missouri has 3,000 slaves in it already. As a territory, it has all the laws on the books that regulate slavery, and so why should that be reversed? Why should Missouri be treated differently than Kentucky or Tennessee were treated, for that matter? But what's going on here is basically an argument over political power. This is not an argument over the morality of slavery. Northerners are not going to fight this on the grounds that slavery is wrong, slavery is evil. Certainly there are people who feel that way, but that's not the thrust in the Congress. The thrust in the Congress is who's going to control the territory west of the Mississippi? Is it going to be the South, or is it going to be the North? Is it going to be Southern constitutional interpretation, Southern economic policies, or Northern constitutional interpretation, Northern economic policies? And so when the bill to admit Missouri into the Union as the 13th slave state showed up in the House of Representatives in 1819, a New York congressman by the name of James Tallmadge attached an amendment to it. This is called the Tallmadge Amendment. The Tallmadge Amendment. Tallmadge. Tallmadge. The Tallmadge Amendment. And what the Tallmadge Amendment did was to allow Missouri to come into the Union as a slave state temporarily. It provided for gradual abolition of slavery in Missouri, the same way that it had been done in the old northern colonies after the Revolutionary War, so that slave children, when they reached their age of 21, would automatically become free, but adult slaves already owned would remain slaves until they died. So in the span of a generation, you'll get rid of slavery in Missouri, and then for the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, you were going to ban slavery completely. So the only piece of Louisiana Purchase that would ever be slave would be Louisiana, which of course had come into the Union as a slave state in 1812. And because the North controls the House of Representatives through dint of superior population, the bill to admit Missouri into the Union temporarily as a slave state with the Tallmadge Amendment to pass gets out of the House. But when it goes to the Senate, it of course is killed. Southerners kill it there. So there is no admission of Missouri into the Union yet, but you set yourself up for a great big fight in the new Congress that is elected that same year. So there's it's congressional election time, midterm congressional elections. So there's elections in 1819. The new Congress is seated that December, so we roll over into 1820. This business of Missouri is the hot button issue. It's all the country seems to be talking about. And the people who had gotten elected to the Congress, or a lot of people gotten elected to the Congress from the North and the South, had run on the Missouri question, and they tended to be hardliners. And so there were Northerners who had won election to the Congress. And remember, it's only the House that is popularly elected. The Senate is elected by state legislatures. The people who had won election in the House were the hardliners who said, no deal, no compromise. Northerners were never going to let slavery enter the Louisiana Purchase. So we're not going to let it get 1 inch of the Louisiana Purchase. And Southerners who insisted the exact opposite. They were going to see slavery spread over the entire Louisiana Purchase. And so these people had come to the Congress basically promising no deal, no compromise, and spewing a lot of, to be frank, paranoia. So Northerners said, hey, look, if we let slavery go into the Louisiana Purchase, what we're forever doing is surrendering control of the government to Southern interest. And that means all of that territory out there becomes slave states, and slavery goes there, and cotton goes there, and the South's politics go there, and the North will be shut out of political power permanently. And therefore, the policies it needs the government to enact will be denied it permanently. And what's more, since Northerners do not want to compete against slave labor, which of course devalues wage labor, it's if you can own a slave and make them work, why would you pay somebody to do the same work? So wages out there will be very low. There's no point in going out there. And so the increasing northern population will stop moving west. And before long, all of the farming land available east of the Mississippi will be occupied. And that means more and more people crowded into the cities, where they will have a hard time finding jobs and a place to live. And with very little money, we will develop a class of homeless and impoverished people who will become increasingly desperate. And sooner or later, what that's going to get you in the North is class warfare in the literal sense of the phrase, not the political sense of the phrase, but the have-nots trying to take from the haves. And of course, this is extreme. It's unlikely that things would have ever gotten that far, but this is the kind of talk that Northerners opposed bringing Missouri into the Union as a slave state, and the precedent that would set are giving to the body politic. And Southerners did the same thing. They said, hey, look, if slavery is stopped at the Mississippi River, then the cash crop economy ultimately dies as the soil wears out. And if we can't make crops, then how do we make a living? And not only how do we make a living, how do we continue to afford our slaves? Slaves are expensive. You've got to house them, feed them, clothe them, provide them medical care, such as it was in this period of history. And the only way that you have the money to do that is from the revenues generated by the crops that they grow. And so if the fields are exhausted, we can't grow the cotton or the tobacco anymore, then we can't afford to keep the slaves, and so we're going to have to free them. But where do they go? Where do they go? They have no money. They have no skills beyond what they've learned in the fields. They have no homes. They have no education. You will create a wandering class of vagabonds who will be desperate to find food, clothing, and shelter, and they will have to steal, and they will have to loot, and they will have to murder in order to stay alive. So what the South ultimately gets if it loses in the Missouri is literal race war. In addition to that, of course, it will become a minority part of the country. The policies will be enacted by the North, for the North's benefit, to the detriment of the South, and this will be a disaster. So economically we'll be ruined, socially we'll be ruined, and we'll be plunged into race war. And again, this is an extreme case. There is a good bit of paranoia that's woven into this, but this is the kind of tale that radical Southern politicians were telling. And of course, this was getting people worked up and excited on both sides, and the banner of no compromise, no deal, no surrender was out there. And since the politicians had all spoke this out loud in order to get elected, they've basically painted themselves into a corner, haven't they? If they back away from that, if they make a deal, if they make a compromise, then they're breaking their pledges to their constituents. And that is usually a recipe for political suicide. You can't say, I'm in favor of X, get elected for being in favor of X, and then as soon as you're in your office, start doing Y. People do not like that, and especially if it's on a big, prominent, hot-button issue, people do not like that, and usually you will suffer a very unpleasant electoral fate because of that. So if the issue of Missouri had been difficult when it first came up, now it's even more difficult. And the one thing that everybody understands, though, is that as bad as this is, you're going to have to find a compromise. The only way out of this is to cut a deal, because if you don't, this thing escalates to the point to where you might start seriously have the possibility of secession. There were Southerners who were already talking about that. Hey, look, if Missouri is going to be treated differently than any other state's ever been, if Missouri's rights and the rights of our citizens can't be protected, if the South's economic interests can't be protected, then what good is the Union? After all, Louisiana Purchase was bought with revenues raised across the entire country. We deserve to get our piece of that as much as the North does, and if we're going to be treated this way, then maybe it's no longer worth being in the Union. And if secession happens, remember, no less a person than Thomas Jefferson had put that idea into the political conversation. If secession happens, does the United States government let it happen? Does it allow the Union to just break up? And if it doesn't, how does it prevent it? Does it prevent it through military means? And does that mean civil war? Nobody wanted to get to that point, North or South. Hardly anybody wanted to get to that point. So you're going to have to find a deal. You're going to have to find a compromise. And was a compromise possible? And of course the answer is yes, because there were men of goodwill in both sections of the country. They were skilled politicians. They understood that compromise is the essential art of politics. And so they crafted a compromise in the House. And this compromise was a package bill. So we'll just call it the package bill, the Missouri Compromise Package Bill. And it had three parts to it, three essential parts. So one of them is going to admit Missouri into the Union as a slave state with no restriction. So Missouri comes into the Union as a slave state, can stay a slave state forever if it wants. So it becomes the 13th slave state. But to counterbalance the admission of Missouri as the 13th slave state, we're going to admit Maine into the Union as a free state. So Maine, the last piece of New England that has not entered the Union. It used to belong to Massachusetts, but it's been made into a territory. And so we're going to bring Maine in as the 13th free state. So we'll keep that balance. Instead of 12-12 now, or I'm sorry, 11-11, it'll be 12-12, and we'll maintain that balance. So Missouri comes in as the 12th slave state, and Maine comes in as the 12th free state. And then for the rest of Louisiana Purchase, we're going to draw a line at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north, which is essentially the southern border of Missouri. And south of that line, and in Missouri, of course, slavery will be permitted. Not required, but permitted. But remember, slavery is the default position, so if you say slavery can go there, it will go there. North of 3630, however, and the rest of Louisiana Purchase, north of 3630, with the exception of Missouri, slavery will be banned forever. So north of 3630, slavery will be banned forever. And so each side gets a state. You divide the Louisiana Purchase. The northern reach above 3630 is a lot more territory than the southern reach. So south of 3630, what are you ultimately going to get? You're going to get Arkansas and ultimately Oklahoma, perhaps. North of 3630, there's only one slave state, that's Missouri. And then how many states ultimately are going to come from the Louisiana Purchase north of 3630? Well, Iowa and Minnesota and North and South Dakota and Idaho and Nebraska and Montana and pieces of Wyoming and Colorado. So a lot of potential states are going to come from there. Now this is palatable in a way because that region was mostly considered to be worthless. The Army had explored it. After Louisiana Purchase, of course, it happened during a drought, so they got there and they looked around. There are no navigable rivers to speak of. There are no massive forests. It doesn't look like anything east of the Mississippi. It's the Great Plains. It's hot, it's humid, it's bitterly cold, and the winters are long in that season. And so the Army had dubbed this region the Great Desert. In other words, you're not going to grow cotton there. So what is the South really losing here? In economic sense, it's not losing anything, although politically it has the potential to lose a great deal if all of that territory eventually becomes states. So this is the deal. It's probably as good a deal as the South could hope for, given the disparity in population between it and the North, and therefore the North's control of the House of Representatives. But when this bill was brought up for a vote, it was shot down. It was shot down. Northerners and Southerners voted against it, and for predictable reasons, because so many new members of Congress had been elected, or old members had been reelected on the promised no deal, no compromise. They had painted themselves to that corner, and now they couldn't vote for this compromise, even though they understood it was the best deal that either side was likely to get. And that created a sense of crisis. I mean, things were already bad, but now a real sense of crisis. Oh my gosh, this is the best deal anyone can envision. This is as good a deal as anybody's going to get, and it has failed. And where does that take us? Does that ultimately take us to secession? Does it take us into civil war? And this is where Henry Clay really asserts himself. This is where his star, which had been rising politically, now reaches its zenith in a sense, because Henry Clay crafted the deal that solved this problem. He crafted what comes to be known as the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise that Henry Clay comes up with consists of three components. So just like the package deal, there are three pieces to it. And the first of those is to admit Missouri into the Union as a slave state without restriction. Missouri can come in as a slave state, can stay a slave state forever. It becomes the 12th slave state. The next piece of Clay's Missouri Compromise is to bring Maine into the Union as the 12th free state. So Maine comes in as the 12th free state to balance the admission of Missouri as the 12th slave state. And then the third part of Clay's Missouri Compromise is to divide Louisiana Purchase up on the line 3630, allowing slavery south of there and in Missouri, but banning it north of there except for Missouri forever. In other words, Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise is the exact same thing as the package deal. Same terms, same division of spoils. But here's the critical difference. The package bill required representatives to swallow the whole thing, up or down. And if they had promised no deal and no compromise, obviously they couldn't vote for it. Clay's compromise is not a single piece of legislation. It is three pieces of legislation. One, to admit Missouri into the Union as a slave state. Another, to admit Maine into the Union as a free state. And a third, to draw the 3630 line. So not one vote, swallow the whole thing or reject the whole thing. Three votes. Three votes. And that's the critical difference, because we only have one political party, and that means that Clay and President Monroe can put maximum pressure on their own people, and that's what they do. So they go to Southerners and they say, hey, on the day that we vote to admit Missouri into the Union as a slave state, show up, proudly cast your vote, brag about it to the people back home. On the day that we vote to admit Maine into the Union as a free state, however, if you don't feel that you can do that, if you feel that doing that breaks a promise you made to your constituents, we don't ask you to come and vote for it and break your word. We just ask you not to vote against it. No, vote against it. Let the North win that day. Vote present. Be sick, be late, be absent. We don't care what your story is, just don't vote against it. And if you can accept 3630, come and vote for it. And if you can't, the same thing. Just don't vote against it. And then they go to Northerners and they say, hey, on the day that we vote to admit Maine into the Union as a free state, show up and vote for it and go home and brag about it. And on the day that we would vote to bring Missouri in as a slave state, we don't ask you to vote for that, especially if you promised your constituents you never would. We just ask you not to vote against it. Let the South win that one. And the same thing with 3630. Vote for it if you can, but if you can't, stay away. Don't vote against it. Let those who favor drawing that line win. And what backs up this request, of course, is the power of the party, because Monroe and Clay and other party leaders basically tell their representatives and their senators, hey, look, if you defy us here, if you vote against things we're asking you not to vote against, then the party's going to destroy you. You're never going to get a committee assignment again. We're going to run people against you for re-election. You're not going to get ever money. So political threat, political arm twisting. And it worked. It worked. It worked. So you had 3 votes beginning in February of 1820 and 3 victories. The bill to bring Maine in as a free state passed, the bill to draw 3630 passed, and the bill to bring Missouri into the Union as a slave state passed. In the House, the margin was 90 to 87, only 3-vote margin, but that's good enough. And of course, the Senate passed all of these things. President Monroe signed all of them into law. And so the package bill, broken up into 3 parts, becomes the Missouri Compromise, and Clay and Monroe managed to shove it through. And now you can look at all the territory the United States owns, and you can say, well, it's decided. We know where there's going to be slavery, and we know where there's not going to be slavery, and that covers the entire domain of the Union. And so this argument's over. It's done. We can put it to bed. We can put it to bed. But of course, it wasn't over, and it wasn't done. Although Clay is a hero, he saved the Union. And that really puts his political career into high gear. He becomes known as the Great Compromiser. Henry Clay becomes the Great Compromiser because he'd saved the Union with the Missouri Compromise. But anyone who cared to think a little bit into the future, of course, was going to realize that the U.S. was still growing. The Spanish Southwest was still there, and in fact, the year after the Adams-Onis Treaty had been signed, Mexico won its independence from Spain. And so are we sure that we will not be expanding into California and Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada? Of course we aren't sure. There are some Americans who envision that sooner or later, the U.S. would spread over the entire Western Hemisphere. Not just into the Spanish Southwest, but Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean and Cuba and all these places would sooner or later become part of the United States. And this is one of the reasons that Southerners were willing to accept the 3630 line, because you envision drawing 3630 across all the way to the Pacific. And remember that Britain holds Canada. Where is there more land? North or south of 3630, and between 3630 and the Canadian border, there's a very finite amount. Below 3630, there's all of Central and South America, as well as what's left of the southwestern portion and the west coast of North America. And how many states might you get out of that? So Southerners could be said to be playing the long game here. But the question, of course, is if the country does expand and it does add more territory, will the issues that have been raised in Missouri not rear their head again? In other words, if the U.S. grows, this problem's going to come back. This problem's going to come back. And there was something more ominous in what had happened in Missouri, too. Even though the country had met the crisis, had averted the crisis, had found a compromise, for the first time we had divided ourselves not over constitutional philosophy per se, not over economic philosophy per se, not over diplomacy or war per se. In all of our previous arguments, you could find people in the middle states and the New England states and southern states who would, be on one side or the other. It wasn't universal that all New Englanders thought this and all Southerners thought this. And it's still not. I mean, let's don't overplay this here. But nonetheless, for the first time, we've had a great political fight that has divided the country between North and South, between free and slave states. And although this argument had not been about slavery as a moral institution or even as an economic system, slavery had been the stand-in for an argument over the balance of political power and which side was going to dominate the national government, and therefore which side was going to be able to use the national government to its own interest. Okay? That's what Missouri had been really about. Nonetheless, for the first time, we had divided ourselves north and south. And one of the people who saw that and perceived it as a great danger was Thomas Jefferson, who is only going to be around for a little bit longer. He's going to die with John Adams on July 4th, within hours of each other, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So he's not going to be around much longer, but he's around to see the debate that grew out of his greatest achievement, which is Louisiana Purchase. He's lived long enough to see what Andrew Jackson had saved for the U.S. and what Jefferson had bought for the U.S. be the source of great peril. to the U.S. And Jefferson writes in 1821, in the aftermath of Clay's and Monroe's success with the Missouri Compromise, quote, "All I fear, do not see the speck on our horizon, which is to burst on us as a tornado sooner or later. The line of division lately marked out between the different portions of our Confederacy is such as will never, I fear, be obliterated," unquote. North has lined up against South for the first time, and what Jefferson senses, and he's not wrong, is it's not going to be the last time. So that finishes chapter 9, and we will move on then to chapter 10 and 11. We're going to take those together as a unit. From this point forward, we're going to be condensing things and going a little bit faster than we have been heretofore. And the focus on everything going forward is going to be, why does the Union ultimately come apart? So in the first two sections of the class, we've basically been creating the Union and building the Union up at the point where it's stable, which it reaches during the so-called era of good feelings during the Monroe administration. But toward the end of the Monroe administration, the problem of Missouri has cropped up. The divisions north and south have manifested themselves, and the whole story going forward from here is the attempt to keep those divisions from breaking up the country, and ultimately the failure of that attempt and the country plunging itself into civil war. So we're done with 9. The next lecture will incorporate 10 and 11 together. And so now a couple of questions for you to answer and email back to me. So who is the inventor of the cotton gin and interchangeable parts? Give me the inventor of the cotton gin and interchangeable parts. Second, true or false, Andrew Jackson's invasion of Louisiana led ultimately to the Adams-Onis Treaty. True or false, Andrew Jackson's invasion of Spanish Louisiana ultimately leads to the Adams-Onis Treaty. Okay? Next question. Who brought the power loom to the United States? Who is the New Englander who brought the secret of the power loom to the United States? Next question, true or false, the package bill and the Missouri Compromise contain the same provisions? True or false, the package bill and the Missouri Compromise contain the same provisions? And the last question, so the fifth question, name President Monroe's Secretary of State. Who is President Monroe's Secretary of State? So 5 questions. Email those in to me. This will be the first part of your objective question on our next test. And look for the subsequent parts of this lecture and make sure that you listen to those and answer the question at those. And of course, as always, feel free to email me if you have questions, concerns, that sort of thing. And I will look forward to hearing from you and talking to you again soon.